The music stopped for exactly 3 seconds when Cale Ashford walked into the hall, and in those 3 seconds, Wren Calder said the one thing nobody was supposed to say about the new Alpha King. "He's annoying," she whispered to her friend Ivy, rolling her eyes as every head in the room turned toward the man in the dark coat. "Look at them, bowing like he invented breathing." Ivy went pale. "Wren, he's right behind you." Wren froze. The warmth of the room seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a prickling awareness on the back of her neck, the kind of feeling that told her, without turning around, that she was being watched. She turned anyway, and there he was. Cale Ashford stood taller than every man in that hall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black and silver, his eyes the pale gold of a wolf who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He was not smiling. He was not frowning either. He was simply looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing it, and then, all at once, his expression shifted into something unreadable. Wren felt it before she understood it. A pull, low and sudden, like a string tied around her ribs, had just been yanked taut. Her breath caught. Around them, the crowd noticed the change in the air, the way predators sense a storm before the first drop of rain falls. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered the word mate, and it spread through the hall faster than fire through dry grass. Cale's jaw tightened. He had waited years for this moment, the moment his wolf would finally settle, finally recognize the one person in the world, built to stand beside him. He had imagined many things. He had never imagined that the first words his mate would ever say about him would be an insult. "Annoying," he repeated quietly, testing the word like it tasted strange in his mouth. Wren's cheeks burned. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Around them, dozens of pack members from a dozen territories stood frozen, waiting to see what the newly crowned Alpha King would do. Some expected fury. Others expected him to claim her on the spot, right there in front of everyone, the way old stories said Alpha Kings sometimes did with mates who did not yet understand their place. Cale did neither. Instead, he stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and something in his eyes glinted with the beginning of a challenge. "You think I'm annoying," he said, "and you've known me for exactly 4 seconds. I've been watching you for longer than that." Wren shot back before she could stop herself. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground. She was not a woman who backed down easily, not even in front of a king, not even in front of the man whose scent had just wrapped around her senses, like something warm and impossible to ignore. You walked in like the whole room owed you something. Everyone bowing, everyone whispering your name like it's a prayer. It's a lot. A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the nearest onlookers, quickly smothered when Cale's gaze flicked toward them. The laughter died instantly. He turned back to Wren, and this time there was the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to unsettle her more than anger would have. "Careful," he said. "People have lost their standing for less. Then I suppose I'll be the first to lose mine for telling the truth." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hall around them seemed to hold its breath, the orchestra forgotten, the food forgotten, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene between the newly crowned Alpha King and the healer from a minor pack who had just insulted him to his face. Wren could feel her heart pounding, not from fear exactly, but from the strange electricity crawling under her skin, the same electricity she imagined must be crawling under his. Cale studied her the way a man studies a puzzle he has just discovered he cannot solve by force. Her hair was dark and pulled back loosely, a few strands falling free around her face. Her dress was simple compared to the silks and jewels worn by the daughters of larger packs, and yet she stood among them without shrinking, without apologizing for taking up space. There was something in the steadiness of her gaze that struck him harder than any insult could. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Around them, whispers had already begun to spread her name through the crowd, but she answered anyway, chin lifted. "Wren Calder." "Wren," he said it slowly, like he was deciding whether he liked the sound of it. "You do know what just happened here?" "I have an idea," she muttered. "Then you know that walking away right now would be considered strange, by everyone watching." His voice had dropped lower, meant only for her, though the whole hall strained to hear it anyway. "So instead of walking away, I'm going to ask you to stay, just for tonight. Is that an order?" "It's a request," he said. "Something I don't make often." Ren studied him carefully, searching his face for the arrogance she had expected from the moment she first saw him striding through those doors, like the entire hall existed for his arrival. She found some of it, certainly. There was a confidence in the way he held himself that bordered on entitlement. But there was also something else, something that had flickered across his expression the instant she called him annoying, something that looked almost like surprise, almost like hurt, quickly buried beneath practiced calm. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll stay, but I'm not taking back what I said." "I wouldn't expect you to." A real smile finally broke through, quick and unguarded, gone as fast as it appeared. Not yet, anyway. The banquet resumed slowly around them, the orchestra picking the music back up, conversations restarting in hushed, excited tones, as word of the new mate bond spread from table to table like wildfire. Ren felt dozens of eyes on her, as Kale led her toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the crush of the crowd, though not far enough to escape the whispers that followed. "They're all staring," she muttered. "They'll stare regardless of what you do tonight," Kale said. "You might as well decide what story they end up telling." "And what story is that?" "The one where you weren't impressed by me," he said. "At least not yet." Something in the way he said, yet made her pulse quicken, in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. She crossed her arms, trying to hold on to the last of her composure. "You say that like you think you're going to change my mind." "I intend to." "Tonight?" "Tonight," he confirmed, and there was something almost boyish in the determination behind his eyes, a stark contrast to the commanding figure who had entered the hall only minutes before. "By the time this banquet ends, you will not think I'm annoying." Ren let out a short laugh, more surprised than amused. "That's a bold claim for a man I've known for 5 minutes." "I'm a bold man." "Clearly." He gestured for her to sit at a table near the edge of the room, away from the noise, and reluctantly, she did. A server appeared almost instantly, offering wine, offering food, offering anything at all, the kind of instant service reserved only for royalty and those standing beside them. Ren noticed the way people glanced their direction every few seconds, some curious, some calculating, a few outright envious. She had never wanted this kind of attention. She had spent her whole life on the edges of important rooms, tending wounds, mixing remedies, staying useful but invisible. Now, suddenly, she was the center of a story she never asked to be part of. "You're thinking very loudly," Kale said, watching her. "I'm wondering how I'm supposed to eat dinner while half the room pretends not to watch me do it." "Ignore them." "Easy for you to say. You've had a lifetime of practice." Something flickered across his face again, quick and complicated. "You'd be surprised how little practice actually helps." Ren glanced at him properly then, past the crown, past the title, past the reputation that had clearly preceded him into every room he had ever entered. Underneath it, briefly, she saw someone almost tired, someone who wore the weight of expectation like a second coat he had never chosen to put on. It softened something in her, just slightly, though she wasn't ready to admit it. "So," she said, picking up her fork if only to have something to do with her hands, "how exactly do you plan to prove me wrong?" "I haven't decided yet," Kale admitted, "but I have all night." "You're very confident for someone without a plan." "I find plans get in the way of interesting nights." Despite herself, Ren felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. She caught it before it became a full smile, but not fast enough. Kale noticed. Of course he noticed. He seemed like the kind of man who noticed everything, filed it away, and used it later without ever announcing that he had. "There it is," he said quietly. "There's nothing. You almost smiled." "I did not." "You did. I have witnesses." He gestured lazily toward the crowded room, and Ren swatted his hand down before anyone could actually look. "Whoa, don't you dare." He laughed then, low and genuine, and something about the sound of it, unpracticed and real, made Ren's chest tighten in a way she didn't have a name for. She told herself it was the bond, the mate pull, some biological trick her body was playing on her, because fate had decided, apparently without consulting her, that this infuriating, self-assured man was meant to be hers. She did not believe in fate deciding things for her. She never had. Growing up in a pack where mates were sometimes chosen more for convenience than connection, she had watched too many bonds curdle into quiet resentment to trust the pull now settling low in her stomach. "You've gone quiet again," Cale said. "Just thinking." About? About how this is supposed to work," she admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. "The whole hall already thinks they know what happens next. Alpha King finds his mate, mate falls in line, everyone lives happily. That's the story they want." "That's not the story I want," Cale said, his voice suddenly serious, all trace of teasing gone. "I don't want anyone falling in line. I want someone who tells me the truth, even when it's annoying to hear." Ren met his eyes and found, for the first time that night, that she believed him. "Then you're in luck," she said, "because I have a lot of truth to tell you." "I'm counting on it," Cale said, and beneath the table, without either of them quite deciding to allow it, his hand came to rest near hers, not touching, just close enough that the warmth of him reached her skin anyway. Neither of them moved away. Across the hall, an older wolf in council robes watched the exchange with narrowed eyes, already calculating what a mate who spoke so freely to the Alpha King might mean for the pack's future. He said nothing yet, but he was already thinking of ways to correct what he saw as a dangerous informality, unaware that the night had only just begun, and that neither Cale nor Ren had any intention of following the script anyone else had written for them. The music swelled again. The banquet moved on around them, full of laughter and clinking glasses, and the low hum of hundreds of conversations. But at their small table near the edge of the hall, something quieter, and far more important had already started. A contest neither of them had planned, between a king, determined to prove himself, and a woman determined not to be so easily won. Neither of them yet understood how far that determination would carry them before the night was through. Ivy found her way back to Ren's side once the crowd began to thin toward the dance floor, sliding into the seat beside her with wide eyes and a barely contained grin. "You do understand what just happened, right?" she whispered. "The Alpha King, your mate, and your first words to him were an insult." "I'm aware, Ivy." "Are you? Because you don't look aware. You look like you're about to either faint or start laughing, and I genuinely cannot tell which." Ren pressed her palms flat against the table, willing her pulse to slow. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Nobody is fine after finding out the most powerful wolf in the territory is their mate. This doesn't happen to people like us." "People like us?" "Healers. Nobody important." Ivy said it without malice, simply stating a truth both of them had grown up accepting. Their pack was small, tucked into the hills at the edge of larger, wealthier territories, respected for its healers, but never courted for alliances or favors. Ren had never expected royalty to so much as glance her direction, let alone claim her as a mate in front of half the ruling packs in the region. "He hasn't claimed anything," Ren said. "He asked me to stay for dinner. For now." "Ivy." "I'm just saying, everyone in this hall is already planning the wedding. You should see their faces." Ivy nodded subtly toward a cluster of nobles near the wine table, their heads bent together in hurried conversation, throwing not-so-subtle glances toward Ren every few seconds. "They're terrified you might actually stick around." "Why would that terrify anyone?" "Because a mate who isn't already tangled up in pack politics is unpredictable. You don't owe favors. You don't have alliances to protect. You might actually say what you think." Ivy's voice dropped even lower. "Which, judging by tonight, you clearly do." Ren allowed herself the smallest laugh, though the sound came out shakier than she intended. Across the hall, Cale had been pulled briefly into a conversation with several older council members, his posture straightening into something more formal, more distant than the version of him who had teased her only minutes earlier. She watched the shift with quiet fascination, the way his expression rearranged itself to fit the moment, easy warmth folding neatly beneath practiced authority. "He's good at that," she murmured. "At what?" "Becoming whoever the room needs him to be." Ivy followed her gaze. "You say that like it's a bad thing. I don't know what it is yet." Before Ivy could answer, Cale excused himself from the council members and crossed back toward their table, his stride unhurried, despite the dozens of eyes tracking his every movement. He arrived just as the orchestra shifted into something slower, a melody meant for dancing rather than background noise. "They want me to make an announcement," he said, dropping easily back into the seat across from Ren, all trace of the formal mask gone as quickly as it had appeared. "About tonight, about you." Ren's stomach dropped. What kind of announcement? The kind that would make tomorrow very complicated for both of us. He studied her face carefully, reading the flicker of panic she couldn't quite hide. "I told them not yet." "Why not?" "Because you called me annoying 4 minutes after meeting me, and I would very much like to change your mind before the entire territory starts planning a coronation ceremony for a bond neither of us has agreed to." Relief loosened something tight in Ren's chest. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I still intend to win." "Win what exactly?" "You," he said simply, without a trace of arrogance this time, just quiet certainty. "Your good opinion of me. Whatever it takes." Ivy, who had been watching the exchange with poorly concealed delight, cleared her throat loudly. "I should go find my brother before he embarrasses himself at the dessert table," she announced, standing quickly, though her grin betrayed exactly how little she wanted to leave. "Have fun, you two." She disappeared into the crowd before Ren could protest, leaving her alone with Kale once more, the noise of the banquet swelling comfortably around their quiet corner. "You didn't have to do that," Ren said. "Stop the announcement, I mean." "I know." "Then why did you?" Kale considered the question longer than she expected, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers. "Because the moment I saw you, something in me settled that hasn't been settled in years. Ever since I took the crown, everyone around me has wanted something. Loyalty, favor, protection, alliance. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every smile has a price attached." He glanced up, meeting her eyes directly. "You looked at me and saw someone annoying. Not powerful. Not useful. Just annoying. Do you understand how strange that felt? How refreshing?" "I'm not sure refreshing was the word I was going for." "No," he agreed, and there was that almost smile again, quick and unguarded. "But it's the word I'm using." The music swelled further, drawing several couples toward the open floor at the center of the hall. Ren watched them for a moment, the easy way partners fell into step together, some clearly comfortable, others clearly performing for the watching crowd. She wondered which category she and Kale would fall into, should they ever dance, and then caught herself wondering it at all. "Dance with me," Kale said, as though he had read the thought directly from her mind. "I don't dance. Everyone dances. Some people are simply worse at pretending they enjoy it." "I really don't dance," Ren insisted, though the corner of her mouth betrayed her again, twitching upward despite her best efforts. "I spend my evenings setting broken bones and mixing remedies, not learning steps for banquets I was never invited to before tonight." "Then let me teach you." "Absolutely not." Ren. Her name in his voice did something unfair to her resolve, low and warm, and edged with quiet amusement. "One dance. If you still think I'm annoying afterward, I'll stop trying to convince you otherwise for the rest of the night." She narrowed her eyes at him. "You're terrible at negotiating." "I'm told I'm excellent at it, actually." "Fine," she said finally, standing before she could think better of it. "One dance, and I make no promises about my feet. I've survived worse threats." He led her toward the floor, one hand settling lightly at her waist, the other closing around hers with a gentleness that surprised her, given the strength she could feel coiled beneath his calm exterior. The pull between them, the one that had knocked the breath from her lungs the instant their eyes met, hummed steadily now, no longer sharp and startling, but warm, low, insistent. "You're doing fine," Kale murmured, as they began to move, slow enough that her unfamiliar steps didn't matter. "I stepped on your foot." "Barely. You're a terrible liar." "I'm an excellent liar," he corrected. "I'm simply choosing not to use that particular skill on you tonight." Around them, the hall watched, whispered, calculated, but for the length of that single song, Ren found she cared less than she expected to. There was something almost peaceful in the rhythm of the dance, in the steady warmth of his hand at her waist, in the low hum of the bond settling further into place with every passing second. She still thought he was arrogant, She still thought the whole hall bowing to him was excessive. But annoying, she realized somewhere in the middle of that dance, was no longer quite the right word. She kept that realization to herself. He had all night to earn it properly, and she intended to make him work for every inch. By the time the song ended, half the hall had stopped pretending not to watch. Ren stepped back from Kale's hold and immediately felt the loss of his warmth, a small, unwelcome detail she filed away and refused to examine. Around them, conversations had shifted entirely toward the two of them, whispered names, passing table to table faster than any servant could carry a tray. A young noblewoman in deep green silk approached almost immediately, her smile polished and practiced. "Alpha King," she said, dipping into a graceful bow before turning her attention to Ren with far less warmth. "And this must be the healer everyone is talking about." "Ren Calder," Kale said, an edge of warning in his tone that Ren didn't miss. "Of course. Calder Pack, was it? Small territory, north of the river." The noblewoman's smile didn't waver, though her eyes swept over Ren's simple dress with obvious calculation. "How fortunate for you." "Fortunate is one word for it," Ren replied evenly, refusing to shrink under the woman's scrutiny. "Lady Priscilla," Kale said, his voice cooling several degrees, "was just leaving." Priscilla's smile tightened, but she inclined her head and retreated into the crowd, though not before casting one last assessing glance over her shoulder. Ren exhaled slowly once she was gone. "Ignore her," Kale said. "She does that to everyone she considers a threat to whatever plans she's currently scheming." "Am I a threat to her plans?" "You're a threat to every noblewoman in this hall who spent the last 2 years hoping the crown would notice them," Kale said, and there was no arrogance in the statement, only plain fact, delivered with the same ease he might use to describe the weather. "Fortunately for you, the crown noticed someone who calls me annoying instead. I'm beginning to think you enjoy that word." "I enjoy that you meant it," he corrected. "Everyone else in this room has spent the evening telling me how brilliant, how wise, how remarkable my decisions have been. You told me the truth within seconds of meeting me. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Ren considered him for a long moment. "You could simply ask people to be honest with you." "I have. It doesn't work. Titles change how people speak, whether they intend it to or not." He gestured vaguely at the hall around them, the glittering crowd, the careful smiles, the practiced bows. "Everyone here is performing for me. You're the only person tonight who hasn't bothered. Maybe I just haven't learned the performance yet." "Please don't," he said, more seriously than she expected. "I'd rather you never learn it." Before she could respond, a servant approached with a small velvet box balanced carefully on an outstretched palm. Kale accepted it with a slight frown, opening it to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, intricate and clearly expensive, the kind of gift meant to announce a claim to anyone who saw it. "What is that?" Ren asked. "A gift," Kale said slowly, "that I did not order." "Then who did?" He glanced toward the council table, where the older wolf in ceremonial robes watched them with an expression carefully arranged into polite neutrality. "Counselor Braddock," Kale said quietly. "He believes a public gift would help settle any doubts about the bond. Reassure the Pax that everything is proceeding as it should, by buying me a bracelet, by marking you as claimed, without actually asking either of us what we want," Kale said, closing the box with a decisive snap. He set it aside on the table without another glance. "I won't do that. You could have just given it to me. It's beautiful." "It's not about beauty. It's about choice. If you decide, eventually, that you want something from me, a bracelet, a mark, anything at all, it will be because you chose it, not because a counselor decided it would look good to the watching Pax." He met her eyes steadily. "I told you earlier, I don't want you falling in line. I meant it." Something in Ren's chest loosened slightly at that, a knot she hadn't realized she was carrying since the moment she'd first heard the word mate whispered through the crowd. She had expected pressure. She had expected the weight of expectation to close around her the instant the bond was recognized. Instead, here was a man refusing gifts on her behalf, refusing to let the council rush a decision that belonged only to the two of them. "That's the first genuinely likable thing you've done all night," she admitted. "I'll take it," Kale said, satisfaction flickering across his face. "Progress." Don't get used to it. Too late. The evening wore on, and Kale, apparently unwilling to accept a single small victory as sufficient, began what Ren could only describe as a campaign. He introduced her to visiting dignitaries with obvious pride rather than obligation. He deflected every attempt by hopeful nobles to steer the conversation toward politics or alliance, insisting instead on asking Ren about her work, her pack, the remedies she spent her days preparing. He had food brought to their table that he clearly remembered her mentioning she liked, though she couldn't recall exactly when she'd mentioned it at all. "You've been paying attention," she said, eyeing the small plate of honeyed pastries he'd had delivered without being asked. "I pay attention to everything," Kale said. "It's mostly exhausting, occasionally useful. When did I mention I liked these?" "You didn't. I asked one of the kitchen staff what the healers from the northern packs typically favor. It was a guess. A very accurate guess. I have my moments." Despite herself, Ren found the evening passing more quickly than she expected. Somewhere between the dancing and the pastries and the low, easy conversation that kept circling back no matter how many interruptions tried to pull them apart, she caught herself laughing, genuinely laughing, at something dry and unexpected he'd said about one of the visiting dignitaries. Kale watched her laugh with an expression of such open satisfaction that she felt heat rise in her cheeks, and looked away before he could notice. He noticed anyway. He always noticed. "There it is again," he said quietly. "There's nothing. You keep saying that. I keep seeing it anyway." "Maybe you're imagining things." "Maybe," he agreed, clearly not believing it for a second, "but I doubt it." Across the room, Counselor Braddock excused himself from the table where he'd been seated and made his way toward Kale's side, his expression composed but his eyes sharp with quiet calculation. Ren felt the shift in the air before he even spoke, the way Kale's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, bracing for whatever the older wolf intended to say. "A word, Your Majesty," Braddock said, his tone respectful but firm, "when you have a moment." Kale glanced at Ren, something apologetic in his expression. "I'll be right back." She watched him step away, watched the two men fall into a low, tense conversation, just out of easy hearing, and felt the warmth of the evening cool slightly in his absence. Whatever the counselor wanted, it was clear from the set of his jaw that it wasn't a simple request, and Ren found herself wondering, not for the first time that night, exactly how much of Kale's easy charm was real, and how much was armor built to survive rooms exactly like this one. She didn't have to wonder long. Within minutes, Kale returned to the table, his expression carefully smoothed back into calm, though something tight remained at the corners of his eyes. "What did he want?" Ren asked. "The usual," Kale said lightly, though the lightness didn't quite reach his voice. "Reminders about duty, about expectation, about what a king owes his territory, whether or not it's convenient for his own preferences." "That sounds heavier than you're making it sound." "It is," he admitted, surprising her with the honesty. "But it's not something you need to carry tonight. Tonight is still mine to spend proving you wrong." "You're very stubborn about that." "I told you, I'm a stubborn man." Ren studied him, searching for the tension she'd glimpsed only moments before, now buried beneath careful composure once more. Whatever weight the council placed on his shoulders, he clearly had years of practice hiding it from the rooms full of people who expected him to carry it effortlessly. She wondered how often he got to simply exist without that weight at all, and found, with some surprise, that she wanted to know the answer. "Come on," he said, standing and offering his hand. "There's somewhere quieter than this hall, if you're willing." Ren glanced around at the crowded room, the watching eyes, the whispered conversations that hadn't once slowed since the moment the bond was recognized. "Quieter sounds good," she admitted, and placed her hand in his. Neither of them noticed Counselor Braddock watching them leave, his expression unreadable, already turning over new plans in his mind, for a bond he had not yet decided how to manage. The quieter place turned out to be a balcony at the far end of the palace wing, reached through a narrow corridor that peeled away from the noise of the banquet hall until the music behind them faded into a distant hum. Cool night air greeted them as Kale pushed open the heavy doors, and Ren breathed it in gratefully, the tightness in her shoulders easing for the first time since she'd arrived. "Better?" Kale asked, watching her reaction. "Much." She moved to the stone railing, looking out over the palace grounds, silver under the moonlight, gardens stretching toward a dark line of trees in the distance. I didn't expect the Alpha King to know how to escape his own party. I've had years of practice. He joined her at the railing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, though he kept a careful, respectful distance. Being watched constantly teaches you where all the exits are. Is that what tonight feels like? Being watched? Every night feels like that, he admitted. It's different with you, though. Different how? He considered the question seriously, staring out at the gardens rather than at her, as though it were easier to be honest with the darkness than with her face. Everyone else watches me to see what I'll do next, what decision I'll make, what favor I'll grant, what mood I'll be in. You watch me like you're trying to figure out who I actually am underneath all of it. He glanced sideways at her. Nobody's done that in a long time. Ren didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them instead. Below, the gardens rustled faintly in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out into the dark. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Anything. Do you actually enjoy any of this? The crown, the title, the bowing?" She turned to face him properly. "Or is it just something you carry because you have to?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, longer than she expected, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual polish, something rawer bleeding through instead. "I used to enjoy parts of it, the idea of protecting something larger than myself, making decisions that actually mattered." He shook his head slightly. "Lately it feels less like protecting and more like performing. Every choice gets weighed against 100 political considerations before anyone asks whether it's actually the right thing to do. That sounds lonely." "It is," he said simply, and the admission seemed to cost him something, a small crack in the composed exterior he wore so effortlessly around everyone else. "I don't say that often. People don't want a king who admits to loneliness. They want someone who seems certain of everything, all the time. I'm not most people." "No," Kale agreed, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. "You're really not." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the distance between them slowly, imperceptibly closing, until his shoulder brushed against hers, and neither of them moved away. Ren found herself studying his profile in the moonlight, the sharp line of his jaw, the tired set of his eyes, that he usually kept so carefully hidden behind confidence. "Tell me something true," she said. "Not something you'd say to the council, not something you'd say to Priscilla, something real." Kale huffed out a quiet laugh. "That's a dangerous request." "I like dangerous requests." He turned to look at her fully then, something shifting in his expression, decision settling behind his eyes. "I was terrified when I felt the bond snap into place tonight," he admitted. "Not because of you, because of what it means. Every Alpha King before me married for alliance, for advantage, for territory. I've spent 3 years being told that's what I would do too, eventually, whether I wanted it or not. And then you walked into that hall and called me annoying, and some part of me thought, finally, someone who has no idea who I'm supposed to be. Someone who might actually tell me the truth." Ren's chest tightened at the honesty in his voice, unguarded in a way she hadn't expected from a man who commanded an entire hall with a single glance only hours earlier. "That's a lot to admit to someone who insulted you within minutes of meeting you." "I told you, I like the truth, even when it stings a little." "A little? Fine. A lot." He laughed again, softer this time, and the sound settled something warm and unfamiliar in Ren's chest. "You have a talent for wounding a man's pride. You'll survive." "I'm beginning to think I might actually enjoy it." She laughed at that, a real laugh, unguarded and bright, the kind she hadn't let herself have all evening, despite the whirlwind of attention and expectation swirling around her since the moment she stepped into that banquet hall. Kale watched her laugh with something close to wonder on his face, as if the sound itself were a small miracle he hadn't expected to witness. "What?" she asked, catching his expression. "Nothing. I just like that sound." "Careful. You're getting sentimental." "I contain multitudes," he said solemnly, and she laughed again, harder this time, leaning against the railing for balance. Kale grinned, clearly pleased with himself, all trace of the earlier weariness momentarily forgotten. They talked for a long while after that, drifting easily between subjects, Kale asking about her work as a healer with genuine curiosity, rather than polite obligation, Ren asking about the years before his coronation, the training, the expectations, the strange loneliness of being groomed for leadership since childhood. She learned that he had lost his older brother years before, the original heir to the crown, and had never fully expected the weight of leadership to fall to him. She learned that despite the confidence he wore like armor, he still second-guessed nearly every major decision he made, running each choice through a dozen scenarios before ever announcing it aloud. "You hide that well," she said, "the uncertainty." "I have to. A king who looks uncertain invites challenge, every pack watching, waiting to see if the crown is weak enough to test." He shrugged, though the gesture carried more weight than he probably intended. Confidence isn't always real. Sometimes, it's just the mask that keeps everyone else calm enough to trust the decisions underneath it. That sounds exhausting. It is. You're the first person in years I haven't had to wear it around, at least not entirely. He glanced at her, something soft and searching in his expression. "I'm not sure what that means yet, but I like it." The night air had grown cooler, and Ren wrapped her arms around herself slightly, more from the chill than any discomfort with the conversation. Kale noticed immediately, of course he did, and without a word, he shrugged out of his coat and draped it carefully over her shoulders, the warmth of it settling around her like a small, unexpected kindness. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. You'll be cold now." "I run warm," he said simply. "Comes with the territory." They stood together a while longer, the distant sounds of the banquet still drifting faintly through the palace walls behind them, though neither of them made any move to return. Ren found herself, somewhere in the quiet stretch of that conversation, forgetting entirely that the man beside her wore a crown at all. He was simply Kale, sharp-witted, and a little too pleased with himself, carrying loneliness underneath his confidence, the way most people carried an old, familiar ache they'd learned to live around. "I still think you're a little arrogant," she said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence. "I'd be worried if you didn't. But maybe," she continued, choosing her words carefully, "not entirely annoying." Kale turned to face her fully, something bright and hopeful flickering across his expression, despite his obvious attempt to keep his tone light. "Only maybe? I'm not giving you the full victory yet. You still have hours left to earn it." "Then I intend to use every one of them," he said, and the warmth in his voice settled somewhere deep in her chest, steady and undeniable, the mate bond humming quietly beneath every word exchanged between them. Behind them, the balcony doors creaked softly, and both of them turned to find a young servant hovering nervously in the doorway, clearly reluctant to interrupt, but equally reluctant to disappoint whoever had sent her. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing quickly. "Counselor Braddock requests your presence. He says it concerns matters that cannot wait." Kale's jaw tightened, the easy warmth of the last hour folding away beneath something more guarded. He glanced at Ren, apology written plainly across his face. "I'm sorry. I have to go deal with this." "It's fine," Ren said, though something in her chest ached slightly at the interruption. "Go. I'll find you after. I promise. I'll hold you to that." He hesitated a moment longer, as though reluctant to leave the quiet balcony and the version of himself he'd only just allowed her to see, before finally turning and following the servant back into the palace, leaving Ren alone, under the stars with his coat still warm around her shoulders, and a strange, unfamiliar ache settling in her chest at his absence. She had no idea yet just how complicated the rest of the night was about to become. The council chamber sat at the heart of the palace, a circular room lined with tall windows and older wolves whose loyalty stretched back generations before Kale had ever been born. He entered to find 5 of them already seated, Braddock at their center, expressions arranged into the careful neutrality reserved for conversations meant to sound like suggestions while carrying the full weight of demands. "You wish to speak with me," Kale said, taking his place at the head of the table without sitting, a small but deliberate signal that he did not intend to stay long. "About the mate bond, Your Majesty," Braddock said, folding his hands together. Word has already spread through every table in that hall. By morning, it will spread through the territories. We need to understand your intentions. My intentions are my own. With respect, said another counselor, a sharp-eyed woman named Odessa. Your intentions have never been only your own, not since the crown passed to you. A mate discovered in public, at a coronation banquet no less, sends a message to every allied pack watching. If that message is unclear, or worse, if it suggests instability, it could be read as weakness. Nothing about tonight suggests weakness. A public disagreement between the crown and his newly recognized mate might suggest otherwise, Braddock said carefully. We understand these matters are delicate. We only wish to advise a swifter resolution, a formal announcement. Perhaps the marking ceremony moved forward, rather than left open-ended. Cale felt his patience thinning, though he kept his expression carefully composed. Years of training holding his temper in check even as frustration coiled tight in his chest. The marking ceremony happens when both parties choose it, not before. Choice is a luxury not every king can afford, Odessa said, not unkindly, though the words landed with the weight of old, familiar pressure. Your father understood that. He married for the good of the territory, and the territory prospered under that union. My father's marriage was a transaction, Cale said, sharper than he intended. I watched what that cost both of them. I have no interest in repeating it. The room fell silent for a moment, several counselors exchanging quiet, uncertain glances. Braddock leaned forward slightly, his voice softening, though the underlying insistence remained. We are not suggesting a transaction, Your Majesty. We are suggesting clarity. The packs need to trust that your mate strengthens the crown, not complicates it. A woman who insults you publicly within moments of meeting you raises questions about her judgment, her respect for the position you hold. She raised no questions I didn't already have myself, Cale said. And I would remind the council that respect for a position is not the same as respect for a person. I'd rather have a mate who respects the person than one who bows to the crown out of obligation. A sentiment easier held in private than defended in front of 100 allied packs, Odessa said. Cale's jaw tightened further, the weight of the room pressing down on him in a way that felt suddenly, painfully familiar. This was the exact conversation he'd feared since the moment he first felt the bond snap into place in that crowded hall. The exact pressure he'd hoped to shield Wren from, at least for one night. He thought of her laughing on the balcony only minutes earlier, unguarded and bright, and something protective hardened in his chest. I will handle my mate bond as I see fit, he said, his voice carrying the quiet, absolute authority that had settled over him the moment the crown passed to his hands. I appreciate the council's concern for the territory's stability, but I will not force a bond that isn't ready simply to satisfy appearances. If that troubles the allied packs, they are welcome to bring their concerns to me directly, rather than pressuring a woman who has done nothing wrong beyond speaking her mind. Braddock studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind his careful expression, though he inclined his head eventually in reluctant acknowledgement. As you say, Your Majesty, we only wish to see the crown succeed. I understand, Cale said, softening only slightly. And I appreciate the council, but this decision belongs to me, and to her, not to the room. He left the chamber before the conversation could stretch further, the weight of it trailing behind him regardless, settling heavy across his shoulders, despite his best efforts to shrug it off. In the corridor outside, he paused, pressing his palm briefly against the cool stone wall, steadying himself, before returning to the banquet, to Wren, to the fragile, unexpected warmth he'd found on that balcony, only minutes before the council's pressure came crashing back down around him. He thought of what Odessa had said, about judgment, about respect for the position rather than the person, and felt a flare of protective anger on Wren's behalf that surprised him with its intensity. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been honest, in a world that rarely rewarded honesty, especially not from someone standing in the shadow of a crown. By the time he made his way back toward the balcony, resolve had hardened into something steady and certain. Whatever pressure the council applied, whatever expectations the allied packs carried into that hall, he would not let it dictate the terms of a bond that belonged only to the two people standing inside it. He found Wren exactly where he'd left her, leaning against the stone railing, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders, moonlight catching the loose strands of hair that had escaped her careful style hours earlier. She turned as he approached, something in her expression shifting immediately at whatever she read on his face. "That didn't look like a pleasant conversation," she said. "It wasn't. Do you want to tell me about it?" Cale considered lying, softening the truth the way he'd learned to soften nearly everything for public consumption. But he thought of what he'd told her earlier, about wanting someone who told him the truth even when it stung, and found he couldn't offer her anything less in return. "The council wants me to move quickly," he said. "Formal announcement, marking ceremony. All of it settled before the Allied pacts have time to question the bond." Ren's expression flickered, something guarded creeping back into her eyes. "And what did you tell them?" "That this decision belongs to us, not to the council, not to appearances." He stepped closer, close enough that the warmth between them hummed steady and undeniable, the mate bond settling deeper with every moment they spent together. "I won't let anyone rush this, not even for the sake of the crown." Something in Ren's shoulders eased, the guarded flicker softening into something more open, more trusting than she'd allowed herself all evening. "That's twice now," she said quietly. "Refusing what they wanted, for my sake. I intend to make it a habit." "Careful," she said, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness, warmth threading through instead. "You're starting to sound like a man trying very hard to prove a point." "I am a man trying very hard to prove a point," Cale admitted, a small, genuine smile finding its way back to his face despite the tension still lingering from the council chamber. "In case you'd forgotten." I hadn't forgotten. She studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful and searching in her gaze. "You're better at this than I expected." "At what?" "Choosing me over what's easy." The words settled between them, quiet and significant, and Cale felt something in his chest tighten at the weight of them, at the trust threading carefully through her voice, despite every reason she had to remain guarded. He didn't respond immediately, simply reached for her hand instead, lacing his fingers through hers with a gentleness that belied the strength he knew rested just beneath his calm exterior. "I intend to keep choosing you," he said quietly, "for as long as you'll let me." Ren didn't pull away. For the first time all evening, she let the warmth of his hand in hers settle, without questioning it, without weighing it against every reason she had to remain cautious. The night stretched on around them, cool and quiet, and full of possibility neither of them had expected, only hours before, and somewhere beneath the distant hum of the banquet still carrying on inside, the bond between them settled a little deeper, a little steadier, refusing to be rushed by anyone but the two people who carried it. They returned to the banquet eventually, though neither of them fully returned to the version of themselves who had entered separately hours before. Ren noticed the shift immediately, the way people's whispers had changed tone, curiosity softening into something closer to acceptance, as though the sight of the Alpha King leading his mate back into the hall, her hand still loosely wrapped around his, had settled some unspoken question the crowd had been carrying all evening. Ivy found her almost immediately, pulling her aside with barely contained excitement, while Cale was drawn into another round of formal greetings near the entrance. "You disappeared for almost an hour," Ivy whispered, eyes wide. "An hour, Ren. Do you know what people are saying?" "I can imagine. They're saying the bond settled faster than anyone expected, that the Alpha King looked at you like," Ivy paused, searching for the right words, "like you're the only person in the entire hall." Ren felt heat rise in her cheeks, glancing instinctively toward where Cale stood, still deep in conversation, though his eyes flicked briefly toward her, as though he'd felt the weight of her attention even across the crowded room. "It's not like that," she said, though the protest sounded weaker than she intended. "It's exactly like that." Ivy studied her more closely, her excitement softening into something gentler, more concerned. "You look happy and terrified, both at once. Is that so obvious?" "Only to someone who's known you since we were pups." Ivy squeezed her hand gently. "Talk to me. What's going on in that head of yours?" Ren glanced around, making sure no one stood close enough to overhear, before letting her guard down slightly, the way she only ever did with Ivy. "I keep thinking about my parents," she admitted quietly. "About how it started for them. Do you remember?" Ivy's expression sobered immediately. "I remember." Ren's parents had been paired young, an arrangement brokered between two smaller packs, eager to strengthen ties through the bond, rather than allowing fate to choose naturally. They had never disliked each other, not exactly, but the marriage had settled into something quiet and transactional over the years, warmth fading into practiced courtesy, love replaced by duty, long before Ren was old enough to understand the difference. She had grown up watching two people who cared for each other in the way neighbors care for each other, polite and steady, and utterly without passion, and had promised herself, somewhere in her early years, that she would never settle for a bond built on obligation rather than genuine choice. "I don't want to become that," she said quietly. "Two people going through the motions because fate decided they belonged together, regardless of whether they'd have chosen each other otherwise. Do you think that's what this is, with Kale?" "I don't know," Ren admitted. "That's the problem. Everyone in this hall already has an opinion about what this bond means, what it should look like, how quickly it should settle into something official. Nobody's asked whether either of us actually wants that, beyond the pull neither of us controls." "He seems to be asking," Ivy pointed out gently. "From what I saw." "He is," Ren agreed, something soft creeping into her voice, despite her best efforts to guard against it. "That's what scares me most, honestly. If he'd been arrogant all night, demanding, dismissive, this would be easy. I'd know exactly what to guard against, but he keeps doing the opposite, refusing gifts the council wanted to force on me, standing up to Braddock on my behalf, listening, actually listening, when I tell him what I think." She shook her head slightly. "It's harder to protect myself from someone who keeps choosing to be kind." Ivy was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Maybe," she said finally, "the point isn't protecting yourself from him. Maybe it's protecting yourself from becoming your parents. Those are different things." Ren blinked, turning the thought over slowly. "What do you mean? Your parents never talked. Not really. Not about what they wanted, what scared them, what they hoped for. They just accepted the arrangement and let it settle into whatever it became, without ever fighting for anything better." Ivy nodded subtly toward where Kale still stood across the hall, his attention drifting back toward Ren every few moments, despite the conversation still unfolding around him. He's fighting. Against the council, against expectation, against the easy path everyone else wants him to take. "That's not nothing, Ren." Ren didn't answer immediately, watching Kale across the crowded room, the easy authority he wore, even while listening politely to whatever the visiting dignitary in front of him was saying, and the way his eyes kept finding hers despite the distance between them. She thought of the balcony, of his admission about loneliness, about the mask he wore to keep everyone else calm, about the raw honesty underneath it, that he'd only shown her, apparently, in years. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "I'm always right. It's exhausting, being this correct all the time." Ren laughed despite herself, some of the tension in her chest finally easing. "I've missed you being insufferable. I've missed you being dramatic about everything," Ivy shot back, grinning. "Truly, this has been a wonderful reunion." Across the hall, Kale finally extracted himself from the lingering conversation and made his way back toward them, his expression brightening the moment his eyes settled on Ren. Ivy, catching the shift, offered a quick, knowing smile before slipping away toward the dessert table once more, leaving the two of them alone amid the swirl of the banquet. "You look thoughtful," Kale observed, studying her face carefully. "I was talking to Ivy." "About?" Ren hesitated, weighing how much honesty to offer, before deciding, somewhere in the space of that hesitation, that honesty was exactly what this bond needed, if it had any hope of becoming something real, rather than something performed. "About my parents," she said, "about why I've spent most of tonight guarding myself against you, even when you keep doing everything right." Kale's expression sobered, genuine interest replacing the earlier warmth. "Tell me." So she did. She told him about the quiet, transactional marriage she'd grown up watching, the polite courtesy that had replaced passion long before she understood what was missing, the promise she'd made to herself as a girl, that she would never settle for a bond built on obligation rather than choice. Kale listened without interrupting, his attention absolute, none of the practiced formality he wore for the council or the visiting dignitaries bleeding into the way he watched her now. "That's why annoying," he said quietly, once she'd finished. It wasn't really about me at all, was it? Not at first. No, Ren admitted. It was about what you represented. Power. Expectation. Everyone bowing without question. It reminded me of everything I promised myself I'd never accept without a fight. I'm glad you fought, Kale said. I'd rather earn this than have it handed to me, because fate decided we belonged together. That's a very different attitude than most Alpha Kings would have, I imagine. Most Alpha Kings didn't grow up watching their parents' marriage fail from the inside either, Kale said, something quieter and more vulnerable slipping into his voice. My father and mother were exactly what you described, polite, transactional. My mother left before I turned 10, unable to keep pretending the arrangement was enough. My father never fully recovered from it, though he'd never have admitted that to anyone but me, and only rarely even then. Ren's chest ached at the admission, understanding suddenly why he'd fought so hard against the council's pressure to rush the bond into something official. He wasn't just protecting her from expectation, he was protecting both of them from repeating a history neither of them wanted to inherit. We're a strange pair, she said softly, both of us terrified of becoming our parents. Strange pairs make the most interesting stories, Kale said, a small smile returning to his face. Or so I've been told. By whom? No one, actually. I just made that up. It sounded wise. Ren laughed, the sound rich and unguarded, and Kale's smile widened at the sight of it, something settled and certain replacing the earlier tension in his shoulders. Whatever fear either of them carried into this bond, whatever history shaped the walls they built long before fate ever pulled them together in that crowded hall, something steadier was beginning to take root between them now, built not on obligation or expectation, but on the slow, deliberate choice to be honest with each other, one conversation at a time. The commotion started near the dessert tables, a sudden cry followed by a startled crowd stepping back in a ragged circle around a young server who had collapsed against the marble floor, her tray of pastries scattered around her, her breathing shallow and quick. Panic rippled through the nearby guests, several stepping further away rather than closer, uncertain what to do. Ren moved before she'd even fully registered the decision, pushing through the startled crowd with the practiced calm of someone who had handled emergencies far worse than a crowded banquet hall. She dropped to her knees beside the young woman, fingers already checking her pulse, her breathing, the color draining from her lips. Someone get me water, Ren said, her voice carrying clear and steady over the murmuring crowd. And ask the kitchen what was in the last tray she carried, now please. A nearby servant scrambled to obey, and within moments, water appeared at Ren's side. She tilted the young woman's head carefully, checking her throat, noting the faint swelling already beginning along her jaw. She's having a reaction to something, Ren said, mostly to herself, running through possibilities with practiced speed. Swelling, shallow breath, no visible injury. Food, most likely. She turned to the gathering crowd. Does anyone know if she has any known sensitivities? Nuts, certain herbs, anything unusual in tonight's dishes? Kale arrived at her side within seconds, having pushed through the crowd the moment he realized what was happening, his earlier ease replaced by sharp, focused attention. What do you need? Space first. Everyone needs to step back. His presence alone accomplished that instantly, the crowd retreating several steps at the simple weight of his authority. And I need my kit. It's small, leather. I left it in the cloakroom with my things. Someone needs to retrieve it immediately. Kale turned to the nearest servant. Go, now. The young man sprinted off without hesitation. Ren returned her attention fully to the young woman on the floor, whose breathing had grown more labored, panic clear in her wide eyes. You're going to be fine, Ren said, calm and steady despite the urgency underlying every movement. I need you to focus on my voice. Can you do that? The young woman nodded weakly, her hand gripping Ren's sleeve with surprising strength. Good. Slow breaths. In through your nose if you can manage it. Ren kept her voice low and even, the same steady tone she used with every frightened patient she'd ever treated, back in her own Pax healing house. You're safe. I'm right here. The servant returned moments later, breathless, Ren's leather kit clutched in his hands. She snatched it open immediately, fingers moving with practiced speed through small vials and packets, until she found what she needed, a pale, crushed herb mixture, she quickly stirred into the water offered earlier. Small sips, she instructed, tilting the cup carefully to the young woman's lips. This will help with the swelling. The crowd watched in tense silence as Ren worked, her earlier nervousness about being the center of attention entirely forgotten, replaced by the sure, practiced confidence of someone doing exactly what she'd trained her whole life to do. Cale knelt beside her, saying nothing, simply present, ready to help however she directed him, watching her work with an expression of quiet, growing admiration. Slowly, gradually, the young woman's breathing began to even out, the frightening swelling along her jaw receding as the herb mixture took effect. Color returned to her lips, and after several long, tense minutes, she managed a shaky but genuine smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're going to be just fine," Ren said, relief evident in her own voice now that the danger had passed. "I want you resting somewhere quiet for the next hour, and drinking plenty of water. No more of whatever was in that last tray, understood?" The young woman nodded, and two attendants gently helped her to her feet, guiding her carefully out of the hall toward somewhere she could rest. The crowd, which had gathered in tense, silent clusters throughout the emergency, began to disperse slowly, murmurs of relief and admiration rippling through the hall. Ren remained kneeling on the floor for a moment longer, packing her kit back together, with hands that had only just begun to tremble now that the crisis had passed. Cale watched her, something unreadable and deeply affected in his expression. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "It was just my job." Ren closed her kit, finally allowing herself to breathe properly. "I've handled worse. Reactions like that happen more often than people realize, especially at large gatherings with unfamiliar dishes." "You didn't hesitate, not for a second." There wasn't time to hesitate. Cale helped her to her feet, his hands steady and warm around hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved, simply standing close together amid the slowly settling crowd, the weight of what had just happened still hanging in the air between them. "I've watched healers before," he said eventually. "Trained ones, respected ones, some of the best in the territory. I've never seen anyone move like that, like the panic in the room simply didn't touch you." "It touches me," Ren admitted. "I just don't let it show while someone needs me." "That's not nothing, Ren." She glanced up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice, the genuine wonder replacing every trace of the easy, teasing charm he'd worn all evening. "You keep saying that. That's not nothing." "Because it isn't," Cale said firmly. "Everyone in this hall bows to me because of a crown I was born into. You just saved someone's life because of years you spent training, learning, choosing to be useful to people who needed you. That's a different kind of power entirely, and it's not one I've ever had." Ren felt heat rise in her cheeks at the raw sincerity in his words, entirely unlike anything she'd expected from the arrogant figure who had first strode into that hall hours earlier. "I think," she said slowly, "that might be the nicest thing anyone said to me tonight. I intend to say nicer things before the night ends." "You're persistent. I told you, I'm a stubborn man." He glanced down at where their hands still remained loosely joined, something soft settling over his features. "Tell me about your work. Really tell me. Not the polite, short version people usually get." So she did, walking with him slowly toward a quieter corner of the hall, while she described the small healing house she ran in her pack's territory, the herbs she cultivated in careful rows behind the building, the satisfaction of watching a broken bone knit back together, a fever break, a frightened patient finally breathe easy again. Cale listened with the same absolute attention he'd given her on the balcony earlier, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than obligatory interest, and somewhere in the telling, Ren realized she had entirely stopped guarding the walls she'd built so carefully around herself only hours before. The lull didn't last long. As the banquet moved into its later hours, the crowd thinning slightly as some of the older guests began to retire. Lady Priscilla reappeared at Ren's side, while Cale was momentarily pulled away by a group of visiting merchants, eager to discuss trade agreements before the night ended. "That was quite a display earlier," Priscilla said, her tone pleasant on the surface, though something sharper glinted beneath it. "Saving poor Marta like that. Very impressive, for a healer from such a small pack." "Thank you," Ren said evenly. refusing to rise to whatever bait Priscilla intended to offer. Of course, skill with herbs is one thing. Priscilla's smile widened slightly, calculating. Understanding the responsibilities of standing beside a king is quite another. I do wonder if you fully grasp what you're walking into. I imagine I'll learn as I go. How refreshingly casual. Priscilla stepped closer, lowering her voice, as though sharing a confidence rather than delivering a warning. I've known Cale for years, you understand. Since before the crown ever passed to him, there are expectations, obligations, entire histories between our families that a newcomer wouldn't understand. I only mention it because I'd hate to see you get hurt, discovering things later that you might have preferred to know now. Ren felt something cold settle in her stomach, despite her best efforts to stay composed. What kind of expectations? Oh, nothing scandalous, Priscilla said lightly, though her eyes tracked Ren's reaction with obvious interest. Simply that our families have long assumed a match between our houses, long before fate decided to complicate matters with a bond neither side anticipated. Cale and I grew up quite close, some might say inseparable, before duty called him elsewhere. She let the implication hang deliberately in the air. I only share this so you understand what you're standing between, should you choose to stay. Before Ren could respond, Priscilla offered a final, pleasant smile and glided away into the crowd, leaving her standing alone with a knot of uncertainty tightening steadily in her chest. She told herself not to believe it, not entirely, recognizing the calculated cruelty behind Priscilla's carefully chosen words, but doubt, once planted, proved difficult to fully uproot, especially on a night already so thick with unfamiliar emotion and unexpected vulnerability. Cale returned several minutes later, his expression brightening the moment he found her, though it faltered quickly at whatever he read on her face. What happened? Nothing, Ren said, though the word came out flatter than she intended. Ren. She hesitated, torn between the honesty she'd promised to offer him and the reluctance to hand Priscilla exactly the reaction she'd clearly hoped to provoke. But she thought of what she'd told him earlier, about wanting truth rather than performance, and forced herself to speak plainly. Lady Priscilla mentioned your families expected a match, that you two were close, before the crown. Something dark passed briefly over Cale's expression, quickly replaced by weary understanding. That's not entirely a lie, he admitted, but it's not the truth either, not the way she's presented it. Then tell me the truth. Our families discussed an arrangement, years ago, before I ever took the crown. I never agreed to it. Priscilla and I grew up in overlapping circles, attended the same gatherings, but there was never anything close to what she's implying. I made that clear to her directly, more than once. He met Ren's eyes steadily, no trace of evasion in his expression. She's disappointed the arrangement never happened, and she's not above using tonight to plant doubt where she can. I'm sorry she got to you before I could tell you myself. Ren studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of deception, finding none. The knot in her chest loosened slightly, though not entirely. Why would she do that? Because if she can make you doubt me, doubt this bond, she still holds on to some hope that things might eventually shift back in her favor, Cale said. It's petty, and it's beneath her, though I imagine she'd disagree with that assessment. That's an unpleasant thing to build an evening around. Welcome to court politics, Cale said dryly, though frustration colored the words. I should have warned you. People here don't always fight fair, especially when a bond as significant as ours threatens plans they've quietly held onto for years. Ren considered his explanation, weighing it against everything she'd learned about him over the course of the evening, the honesty on the balcony, the refusal to accept Braddock's demands, the quiet, genuine admiration he'd shown watching her work only an hour earlier. I believe you, she said finally, and meant it. Relief flooded Cale's expression, something in his shoulders easing that she hadn't fully realized had tensed. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If I find out you're lying, Priscilla will be the least of your problems. Noted, he said, a small, grateful smile returning to his face. Though I should warn you, I have every intention of proving myself trustworthy for a great deal longer than tonight. We'll see. They fell back into step together, moving toward a quieter edge of the hall, where the noise of the remaining guests had thinned considerably, the night stretching later, the crowd thinning further with each passing hour. But the encounter with Priscilla lingered at the edges of Wren's thoughts, a reminder that whatever warmth she'd found with Cale that evening existed inside a much larger, more complicated world, full of political calculation and old rivalries that had nothing to do with either of their genuine feelings. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually, as they settled near a quiet alcove away from prying eyes. "Always. Is this what it's going to be like? Constantly defending what's real against people who want to twist it into something else?" Cale considered the question seriously, none of his usual easy deflection creeping into his response. "Sometimes," he admitted, "court politics rarely stay simple, especially around the crown, but I'd rather face that with someone who tells me the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, than spend my life surrounded by people too afraid to be honest with me at all." He reached for her hand again, steady and certain. "I meant what I said earlier. I intend to keep choosing you, even when it's complicated, especially when it's complicated." Wren felt something settle deep in her chest at the certainty in his voice, the doubt Priscilla had planted finally losing its grip entirely. Whatever challenges waited beyond tonight, whatever old rivalries or political maneuvering threatened to complicate the bond steadily strengthening between them, she found herself believing, for the first time all evening, that she wanted to face them beside him, rather than walking away before they'd even properly begun. As midnight approached, the banquet hall had thinned considerably. Most of the older guests retired for the evening, leaving only the younger crowd still lingering near the dance floor, and the last of the musicians playing something slow and unhurried. Cale found Wren near the tall windows overlooking the gardens, and, without a word, offered his hand once more. "Walk with me?" She took it without hesitation this time, no trace of the earlier caution she'd carried into the evening, and together, they slipped out through a side door into the palace gardens, moonlight silvering the paths between carefully tended hedges and late-blooming flowers. The noise of the banquet faded quickly behind them, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant, gentle sound of a fountain somewhere ahead. "This is beautiful," Wren said, breathing in the cool, fragrant air. "My mother designed most of it before she left," Cale said quietly. "I used to come here as a child, when the palace felt too big, too loud. It's one of the few places that still feels like mine, rather than the crown's." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following the winding path deeper into the gardens, until they reached a small stone bench near the fountain, tucked away from the palace lights entirely, the stars stretched clear and bright overhead. Cale gestured for her to sit, settling beside her close enough that his warmth pressed gently against her side. "I have to tell you something," he said, and something in his tone made Wren's chest tighten with anticipation. "Okay." "I've spent this entire night trying to prove you wrong," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care. "Trying to prove I wasn't annoying, that I was worth more than a first impression formed in the space of 5 seconds. And somewhere along the way, I think I forgot to ask myself why it mattered so much." He turned to face her fully, moonlight catching the sincerity in his expression. "I've had people admire me my whole life, respect me, fear me, want things from me. Nobody's ever looked at me and simply seen a person before tonight. Not since my brother died, honestly. Not really." Wren's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice, entirely stripped of the performance he wore so effortlessly for everyone else. "Cale, let me finish," he said gently. "I don't know why the bond chose you. I don't understand fate well enough to explain any of this properly. But I know that tonight, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I wasn't performing. I wasn't calculating what to say to keep the peace, or protect an alliance, or satisfy the council. I was just talking to you, and it was the easiest thing I've done in years." "It didn't feel easy," Wren said softly. "You worked very hard tonight." "I worked hard because I wanted to earn something real," Cale said, "not because it came easily. There's a difference." He reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I know this bond is enormous, and complicated, and tangled up in politics neither of us fully control. But I needed you to know that whatever happens next, tonight wasn't a performance for me. It was the realest thing I've felt in years." Wren studied his face in the moonlight, searching, as she had all evening, for any trace of the arrogance she'd first assumed defined him entirely. She found none of it now, only quiet vulnerability, honest and unguarded, offered without any expectation of what she might say in return. "I came into that hall tonight expecting nothing," she said slowly. "I certainly didn't expect to find my mate standing in the middle of it, let alone one wearing a crown I assumed would make him insufferable." A small smile tugged at her lips. "I was wrong about a lot of things tonight, including the annoying part." "Especially the annoying part," she admitted, laughing softly. "Though I reserve the right to still find you annoying occasionally, it seems only fair, given how thoroughly you've earned my patience tonight." "I'll take annoying occasionally," Cale said, relief and joy mingling openly across his face. "It's an enormous improvement from where we started." They sat together for a long while after that, the conversation drifting into quieter, gentler territory, both of them slowly shedding the last of the guarded walls they'd carried into the evening. Ren told him about her mother's garden back home, the herbs she'd learned to identify before she could properly read, the quiet satisfaction of watching something grow under careful attention. Cale told her about his brother, about the weight of a crown he'd never expected to carry, about the strange, unfamiliar lightness he felt now, sitting beside someone who saw him clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of title and expectation. "Thank you," Ren said eventually, "for tonight. For refusing the counsel, for standing up to Priscilla, for choosing honesty, even when it would have been easier not to." "Thank you," Cale echoed, "for staying, for giving me the chance to earn something I didn't think I deserved when this night started." The fountain trickled quietly beside them, stars stretched endless overhead, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke at all, simply sitting together in the settled, comfortable quiet of two people who had spent an entire evening, slowly, carefully choosing each other, one honest conversation at a time. The peace of the garden didn't last uninterrupted. Footsteps approached along the gravel path, and both Cale and Ren looked up to find Counselor Braddock standing at the edge of the fountain's light, his expression grave in a way that immediately set Ren's nerves on edge. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty," Braddock said, though his tone carried little apology. "But this cannot wait until morning." Cale rose slowly, the easy warmth of the last hour hardening back into careful authority. "What is it?" "Word has reached us that several allied pacts are questioning the strength of the bond, given the unusual circumstances of tonight's discovery. There are whispers, Your Majesty, that a mate who insulted the crown so publicly might not hold sufficient respect for the position to serve properly beside you. Some are suggesting the marking should happen tonight, before the rumors spread further and weaken confidence in the crown's stability." Ren felt her stomach drop, the warmth of the evening curdling instantly into something colder. "Suggesting how? Exactly?" Braddock's eyes flicked toward her, something unreadable in his expression. "The council believes it would settle every doubt at once. A public marking, before the remaining guests depart tonight. It would silence any question of the bond's legitimacy immediately and firmly." "No," Cale said, the single word carrying absolute finality. "Your Majesty, the stability of the crown." "I said no, Braddock." Cale's voice dropped into something low and commanding, the full weight of his authority settling over the garden like a physical presence. "I told you in the council earlier tonight that this bond will proceed on our terms, not the council's, and certainly not because a handful of allied pacts are gossiping over wine. If they have concerns about the crown's stability, they may bring them to me directly. I will not force a marking on a woman who has not yet chosen it, regardless of what rumors demand." "And if she never chooses it?" Braddock asked, quieter now, though the question still landed with weight. "What then, for the crown's stability?" "Then I will find another way to reassure the pacts," Cale said, "one that doesn't require taking a choice away from the person standing beside me." He glanced at Ren, something fierce and protective burning steady in his eyes. "This is not negotiable, Braddock. Not tonight. Not ever." The counselor studied him for a long moment, some internal calculation shifting visibly behind his composed expression, before finally inclining his head, though clearly unconvinced. "As you wish, Your Majesty. I only hope your confidence proves well placed." He turned and disappeared back down the path, leaving the garden quiet once more, though the earlier peace had shattered entirely in his wake. Ren stood slowly, arms wrapped around herself against a chill that had little to do with the night air. "That was because of me," she said quietly. "The pressure. The gossip. All of it started because I embarrassed you in front of the entire hall." "You didn't embarrass me," Cale said firmly, closing the distance between them immediately. "You were honest. There's a difference, and I won't let anyone, including my own counsel, convince either of us otherwise. But it's causing you problems, real ones, with the packs, with the stability you're supposed to protect." "Every king faces problems," Cale said. "That's not new. What's new is having someone worth facing them for." He took her hands gently, holding her gaze steady despite the tension still lingering from Braddock's visit. "I meant what I told him. This bond happens on our terms, or it doesn't happen at all. I won't force a mark on you, because a room full of nervous allies wants reassurance. If you choose this, someday, I want it to be because you chose it, not because the crown demanded it." Ren felt something in her chest ache at the fierce sincerity in his voice, the absolute refusal to let political convenience dictate the terms of something that belonged only to the two of them. "You keep proving me wrong," she said softly. "Every time I think I understand exactly who you are, you do something like this." "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said, a small, genuine smile breaking through despite the tension of the last few minutes. "It's the opposite of a complaint." They stood together in the quiet garden a while longer, the earlier peace slowly returning despite the shadow Braddock's visit had cast over it. Ren found herself studying Cale more closely now, searching not for the arrogance she'd assumed defined him hours earlier, but for the quiet, stubborn integrity that had revealed itself again and again throughout the night, in every refusal, every honest admission, every moment he'd chosen her comfort over political convenience. "The sky's starting to lighten," she observed eventually, glancing toward the eastern horizon where the darkest hours of night had begun their slow retreat. "Dawn's still a while off," Cale said, though he followed her gaze regardless. "We have time yet." "Time for what?" "Whatever you decide you want it for," he said simply, offering no pressure, no expectation, only the same steady patience he'd carried through every challenge the night had thrown at them so far. "I told you, this is your choice. All of it. I intend to keep honoring that, tonight and every night after, for as long as you'll have me." Ren looked at him for a long moment, the weight of the entire evening settling into something clear and certain in her chest. The guarded walls she'd carried into that banquet hall hours earlier finally, fully dismantled. Whatever came next, whatever pressure the Council or the Allied pacts continued to apply, she found herself certain, for the first time, that she wanted to face it standing beside him. "Walk with me a little longer," she said, "and then I'll tell you what I've decided." Cale's answering smile held more hope than he probably intended to show, though he said nothing further, simply offering his hand once more as they continued down the quiet garden path together, the first pale hints of dawn beginning to touch the edges of the sky above them. They walked until the garden path curved back toward the small stone bench by the fountain, the sky above steadily brightening from deep indigo into the soft gray that precedes true morning. Ren stopped there, turning to face Cale fully, the last of her hesitation finally settling into something calm and certain. "I spent tonight watching you prove yourself, over and over," she said. "Refusing gifts you didn't think I should be pressured into accepting, standing against your own counsel, twice, to protect a choice that belonged to me. Listening, really listening, when I told you about my work, my fears, my parents' marriage, and everything I promised myself I'd never repeat." She took a slow breath. "You didn't have to do any of that. You could have taken the easy path Braddock kept offering you. You didn't." "I told you," Cale said quietly. "I wanted to earn this properly." "You did," Ren said, and something in her voice carried the full weight of the decision settling into place. "I don't think you're annoying anymore, Cale Ashford. Difficult maybe, stubborn, absolutely, but not annoying." She stepped closer, closing the last of the distance between them. "I choose this. I choose you, not because fate decided it for us, and not because a council demanded it to settle some political worry, because you spent an entire night proving exactly the kind of man you are, and I want to know that man for the rest of my life." Cale's breath caught, something raw and overwhelmed crossing his features before he could compose himself. "Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything." He reached up, gently brushing a loose strand of hair back from her face, his hand lingering warm against her cheek. "Then I need you to know," he said softly, "that once this happens, there's no undoing it. Not for either of us. I need you absolutely certain, not swept up in the moment, not because dawn is beautiful and the night has been long." "I'm certain," Ren repeated, steady and unwavering. "I've watched you all night, Kale. Not the crown, not the title. You, and I choose you." Something fierce and grateful broke across his face, and he pulled her gently closer, resting his forehead against hers for a long, quiet moment before speaking again. "Then I choose you too," he murmured. "Not because the council wants stability, not because fate tied us together before either of us had a say, because somewhere between you calling me annoying and watching you save a stranger's life with steady hands, I fell for the person standing in front of me, entirely and completely." Ren tilted her head back to look at him properly, the first golden light of true sunrise beginning to spill over the garden walls, catching in her dark hair and softening every line of the palace behind them. "Then mark me," she said quietly, "not as your subject, not as your crown's reassurance, as the woman who chose you back." Kale's hands trembled slightly as he gently moved her hair aside, exposing the curve of her neck, his expression a careful mixture of reverence and restrained emotion. "Last chance to change your mind," he said softly, though his voice carried no real doubt, only tenderness. "I'm not going to change my mind." He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, to hesitate, to reconsider, and when she didn't, when she simply tilted her head slightly to grant him easier access, he pressed a gentle mark against her skin, warmth and certainty flooding through the bond the instant it settled fully into place. Ren gasped softly at the sensation, warm and grounding, and utterly unlike anything she'd expected, the mate bond that had first knocked the breath from her lungs hours earlier, finally settling into something steady, permanent, entirely her own choice, rather than fate's alone. Kale pulled back slowly, studying the mark with something like wonder, before meeting her eyes again, his own bright with emotion he no longer bothered concealing. "How do you feel?" "Certain," Ren said, a smile breaking across her face, easy and unguarded in a way she hadn't allowed herself all evening. "Completely certain. Even though I'm still occasionally annoying?" "Especially because you're still occasionally annoying," she said, laughing. And Kale laughed too, low and genuine, pulling her close against him, as the sun finally crested the garden walls fully, golden light spilling across the paths, the fountain, the two of them standing together at the end of a night that had started with an insult and ended with a choice neither of them regretted. Behind them, unseen, a few of the palace's earliest risers had gathered at the edge of the gardens, drawn by whispers that had traveled even through the quietest hours of the night. They watched the Alpha King and his newly marked mate standing together in the golden morning light, and understood, without needing to be told, that whatever story the council had hoped to write for this bond, the true story had already been decided hours earlier, one honest conversation at a time, by two people who had chosen each other freely, exactly as it should have been from the very beginning. Ren glanced back toward the palace, toward the hall where the banquet had begun with a single, careless insult that had somehow led her here, standing in the sunrise beside a man she no longer thought of as a stranger, or a king, or an obligation, but simply as Kale, hers, chosen and certain. "So," she said, glancing up at him with the faintest trace of her earlier teasing returning to her voice, "did you prove me wrong?" Kale considered the question with mock seriousness, though his smile gave away exactly how pleased he was with the answer. "I suppose I'll let you decide that." "I already have," Ren said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the palace slowly woke around them. "You did." And as the sun rose fully over the kingdom, settling gold and warm across the gardens where their bond had finally been sealed, neither of them doubted, even for a moment, that whatever challenges waited beyond that morning, they would face them exactly as they had faced this long, unforgettable night, together, honestly, and entirely by choice.